All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking time to be on this webinar with us this morning. Just a few housekeeping things. We will be recording this, so you can go back through later on and listen again, or for those who haven't, who weren't able to join us, or if you'd like to share it with anybody that you think would benefit from hearing this presentation. And Stephen would like to make this more of a discussion if we can. So instead of waiting until the end to ask questions, feel free as we go through the presentation to unmute yourself, don't be shy, and ask questions as we go. Or if you'd like, you can put them in the chat box and I'll kind of monitor them as we go on. So without further ado, I will give a quick intro today of Stephen Mann, who's our speaker. So with 24 years of experience in tax and auditing, Stephen Mann is the director in charge of the Cincinnati office of Blue & Co. He has served clients in a broad range of businesses, including manufacturing, distribution, construction, professional services, dealerships, and nonprofits. And he is also on the ACI board and serves as our treasurer. So I will turn the floor over to you, Stephen. Take it away.
All right. Well, like Jen said, we want this to be a discussion today. We're fortunate to have a good group, but we've got less than 20. And so I think we can have an open discussion. So I am going to encourage anybody, if we go over something and you have a specific question about that, let us know. The material that I've prepared, if I were to just go through it, I could go through it in 30 minutes. Jen has scheduled us for more than an hour. So rest assured, we're going to have plenty of time to get through all the material that I have prepared, as well as answer your questions. I will say, to get started, since March 27th, this has pretty much been the only thing that I've done. There's been significant interest by everybody about this program. It's different than any program that's ever been offered before, with a loan program being guaranteed by the SBA. That part not unusual, but the part where the government has provided a forgiveness provision. Essentially, the government is going to make a loan payment on your behalf. And so due to that, and due to the uncertain economic times that we all face today, even companies that are currently working, we all will be impacted by this pandemic at some point. Maybe not today. Certainly construction hasn't felt it yet. My profession hasn't felt it yet. But we can expect that this will eventually come around to affect all of us. It's just a matter of when. So while this support maybe publicly, or maybe the intention was directed towards covering payroll for a finite period of time, 8 weeks, the program has morphed into being really kind of a safety net for all small businesses under 500 employees, and actually some businesses larger than 500 employees, to provide them a safety net to help them weather whatever storm that they may face related to this. So what we're going to discuss today is not about the application process, but we're going to discuss today specifically about that forgiveness provision. And like I said, I think the best way to describe it is that the government is going to make a loan payment on your behalf, is how I want everyone to be thinking about that forgiveness provision. Certainly, if you're on the call today, I'm going to assume that you received funds through the first round of the P3 process. If you're on the phone, on the call today, and you did not receive P3 funds, do know that the Senate has already passed additional funding to replenish this program with another $300 billion. We expected that the first round would go fast, and it did. I would expect this next round of funding to go even faster. So my one thing about the application process would be, if you have not secured funds via this program yet, and you are eligible, I would highly encourage you to work with a sense of urgency, to work with your lender that you have your best relationship with, to make sure that you're front of the line, so to speak, and you've got all the information available to them. So when this next round does get approved and SBA starts approving applications again, to increase your chances of receiving assistance under this. Having said that, just a little bit of background. The CARES Act was a huge law, covered a bunch of different topics. The P3 program was in Section 1102, and that was about making the loan available to borrowers. The forgiveness provision wasn't in Section 1102. It was a separate section in the CARES Act. So what I'm referring to is the government making a payment on your loan was found in Section 1106. And there's a bunch of criteria related around the forgiveness. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I think the things that we're going to go over today are going to be very similar to the discussion that I'm having one-on-one with our clients that receive these funds. The very first thing that we need to do is kind of have a broad overview of this forgiveness program. Many people believe that all they have to do is keep all their employees on and keep them paid, and 100% of the loan will be forgiven. And certainly that is the intent. But they had to have some way to verify that. And so they put in specific measurements that will determine the amount of the forgiveness. So it's extremely important that each company that received these funds understand the things that go into allowable costs, things that you can spend the money on, as well as the additional reduction calculations that are going to be applied to ensure that you have maintained workforce and maintain salaries and wages. Those calculations are not simple. They are very rigid, very structured, and so you must be aware of them. And what we're going to talk about today is to educate you about those and help you to pre-plan for not only the use of the funds, but to make sure that you're in a position to where those calculations are favorable for you and not causing you to limit or have the amount that otherwise would have been eligible for forgiveness to be reduced. So those items, I think today that we're going to cover, there's 4 allowable expense categories, and those items are payroll cost, payment on interest of any covered mortgage, payment on any covered rent obligation, and payment on any covered utility payment. Well, in 1106, when they talk about these things, they mention that the following cost must be cost incurred and paid. So the very first thing that I like to do with clients is to emphasize that it says incurred and paid, and I underline both of those words. I'm looking at the list of people on here, and we have several people on here that are the main accounting or main finance person for your company. And so you might recognize that paid certainly sounds like cash basis of accounting. That's easy enough to understand. But they also use the word incurred. And we're assuming that means closer to accrual basis of accounting. But when you think about actually applying both of those terms to have an expense that is incurred and also one you've paid, are two thresholds that you're going to have to meet. So right at the very beginning of this provision, you can see that this is going to take some significant understanding and planning to make sure that you're meeting those thresholds. Using payroll as an example, most payroll is paid in arrears. So if we're working on costs being covered and it being payroll over this 8-week period of time, we immediately have a question. Is it the 8 weeks that our employees worked, or is it the 8 weeks in which they received the paychecks, which typically is after the period worked? A literal reading of this would be it needs to be both. So that's one area where we're expecting there will be further guidance to clarify how they want us to apply that provision. But you can see that that's going to be, it would be difficult to be able to do both, to be able to change your payroll process to be real time, so that it would match up. The 8 weeks worked would actually be the 8 weeks that are paid. Today, for planning purposes, what we're telling our clients is let's focus on the payroll periods that fall within the 8 weeks. We do believe there will be guidance that will clarify that particular issue. The reason why we have some confidence in that is in the 1106 provision, they said there would be guidance within 30 days of enactment. So today's April 23rd. We're expecting we should receive that by April 26th. Certainly SBA and Treasury Secretary have been busy with working on this next round of funding, so that may be delayed, but we do believe that that guidance will be coming. They have further reiterated that there will be guidance in their Q&A and also in their interim final rule that they provided as it relates to forgiveness. So we're on the lookout for clarity on that issue. The other thing that we need to really focus on is we need to understand that these expenses are expenses that are incurred and paid during the next 8 weeks. So in 1106, they use the term covered period. They said these allowable expenses that are paid within the covered period. And in 1106, they define covered period as being the 8 weeks from loan origination date. Since then, we've received guidance via the Q&As that the 8 weeks will not start with when you sign your loan documents, but rather will start when you receive the funds. So if you sign loan documents on a Monday and your bank doesn't fund your loan until Thursday, meaning putting the money in your bank, that your 8 week period will start on Thursday, the day that the money gets put in your bank. The other area where there's been significant confusion around this is they use the exact same term covered period in 1102. In 1102, where we talked about loan origination, they also defined allowable expenses. And they also defined covered period as being a different period. They defined it as being February 15th, 2020 through June 30, 2020. So there's been some confusion about, okay, can I only spend the money up through June? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we believe that 1102 was just for loan origination, and that 1106 just is for forgiveness. And then after the forgiveness amount is calculated, that the remaining amount, the non-forgiven amount, you treat just as a loan that you have to pay back. And so likely there's no restrictions on how that money is spent. As we move on, we need to really understand what payroll costs are. Prior to the CARES Act, if you'd asked me, what was payroll cost, I would have said payroll cost included wages I pay to my employees, in addition to payroll cost and unemployment insurance. I would have put all those things in under payroll cost. Well, they've defined payroll cost much differently. They've defined a payroll cost to include salary, wages, commissions, payments of cash tips, payment for vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick leave, allowance for dismissal or separation. So if you're paying somebody a severance payment because they've been let go or there's been some other reduction, that payment to them would also count under this definition. Then they've also added into payroll cost any payments for group healthcare benefits, including insurance premiums, as well as payment of retirement benefits and payment of any state or local taxes assessed based upon compensation of employees. That area we now understand to be probably for everybody on the call is only the unemployment insurance that you're paying into the state of Ohio. So those are all the things that are covered under payroll cost. There's also payment of any compensation for sole proprietors or independent contractors. Originally, when the first law come out, we thought, okay, they want companies to include not only their employees, but also their independent contractors. But they came back and they clarified that to say, no, we did not mean that. We only meant that when those sole proprietors or those people who are independent contractors, if they were to apply for a loan, that they would be eligible for their own pay, if you will. And we've got some more guidance on that now about how that would be calculated. If there's anybody on the call today that is a sole proprietor, I'm going to ask you to speak up, and I'll talk about your situation specifically because it's a little unique. If not, we're going to skip that part. There are some things that payroll costs do not include. It does not include compensation for any individual that makes more than $100,000. So there was some question at the beginning about do you exclude all of their pay or just their pay that's over $100,000? And we know now that the intent was just only their pay that exceeds $100,000. So for example, if you have somebody that's on a salary making $120,000 a year, you would only include them up to $100,000 in the calculations. The other area where there was a lot of confusion was on to exclude taxes imposed under these 3 chapters in the Internal Revenue Code, which relates to FICA and federal income tax withholding. They have come out and clarified that they did not intend to exclude employee withholding. What they meant to exclude was the employer taxes. So I don't think that now will be an issue for anybody. If you're starting out with gross wages for your employees, it doesn't include employer taxes anyway. So we've got clearance on that to understand what they meant. The other thing that they've added in here is any compensation of any employee whose principal residence is outside the United States. This once again is an area where there needs to be some more clarity. Being here in Cincinnati, we're very accustomed to the term of principal place of residence as it relates to do you live in Kentucky, Ohio, or Indiana? And usually there's several determining factors, but the overriding one is which state did you spend more than half your time in as your primary residence? So we understand what it means for state law, but usually when it comes to federal law, we're usually talking about are you a citizen or are you an authorized individual? But they've used a different term, which we're not accustomed to in federal law. So what that means, we probably need some more clarity on. Does it mean people that spend more than half their time in the U.S., regardless of where they are a citizen? We probably need to find that out. So if you have that situation where you have individuals inside your company that live in multiple countries during the course of the year, you may need to look into that further. It's kind of hard to do construction work though if you're not living here in the area, so it may not be as big an issue. The other 2 things that are included, I'll say, are just double dip provisions. If you're using one of the previous laws to cover your people that are out on sick leave or family medical leave due to the coronavirus, and you're being reimbursed under those provisions, which give you credit via payroll tax reductions to cover that cost to you, you can't also use those same costs in trying to meet this forgiveness calculation for P3. So I think that's pretty clear. All right. So I have a lot of people that when I'm having discussions, it's amazing how many calculators that I've had sent to me. Hey, can I just use this? I found this simple, easy to use calculator on the internet. I Googled forgiveness calculator and it looks like I just have to enter 4 numbers and it shows all my loans going to be forgiven. So why can't I just use that? Most of most of what's happened in the last 2 to 3 weeks. There's been a huge push to get information out as fast as possible. And certainly it's been helpful for all the different organizations and individuals that have pushed out information. ACI has done a great job, I think, with their toolbox to get information to people. But this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of calculator. And many of the inputs that go into this calculation require a bunch of math calculations behind them to get to the input number that you're entering. So I would say certainly, take a look at some of those calculators that are out there if you want to gain a general understanding. But as far as actually relying on that to support what your application is going to be to the bank when you request forgiveness, I think is going to be inadequate. I also think would be inadequate or maybe even be misleading if you don't understand the inputs that go into those calculators. Interesting enough, I probably have seen 20 different calculators, and we're going to talk about a couple provisions where later on when we talk about salary reductions, that probably I can find you 20 different ways people have interpreted how that should be calculated. What we're doing with our clients is we're walking them through a multi-step process, and we've developed our own internal use tool for us to be able to gather the data and to do all of the underlying calculations, so that we've got good supportable numbers to go into those inputs and then apply it through this calculation. But even the tool that we've developed, we have to modify it for every client situation because there are uniquenesses with each client regarding pay periods and the date you got the loan, et cetera, that impacts how the calculation is done. All right, so I think we've went through and we understand what are the allowable costs. We understand the period of which we have to spend the money. All right, so that part I say will be is the easiest part because you can see what you can see. It's trying to see what you can't see is the bigger issue, and so there's two specific calculations that get done that even if you spend the money on allowable expenses, the purpose of these calculations are to reduce the amount of your loan that eventually will be forgiven. And so when I say that, I think it makes more sense if I say will reduce the amount of the payment the government will make on your loan. And this is where we need to really spend a lot of time because going through discussions with clients, they think, well, if I spend all the money, it's going to be forgiven. So I just might as well just, spend it any way I can and all these allowable costs. But what I'm cautioning people is when we run these sample calculations, sometimes it may end up, you may spend 100% of the money, but only 50% of that amount is going to be the loan payment that the government makes on your behalf. So you can see, that situation may be something that may be totally fine. It may be something that you're comfortable with and remains a good business decision for you. But we wouldn't want anybody to spend the money in a way that they otherwise wouldn't spend it just because they got these P3 funds and end up at the end of this with just a loan payment they have to pay back with no cash of which to do it because they've already spent it. So I think this is the real part of the planning process that I want to focus in on today, because I think this is the biggest risk and the biggest unknown that everybody is kind of glossing over. So the very first one is they're going to, regardless of the amount that you spend, they're going to reduce the amount that's going to be forgiven by a reduction in your head count. And everybody knows that, maintaining salary, maintaining head count was one of the things that this was intended to do. And so the calculation that they have come up with to be able to measure that is we're going to talk about in detail. But it's a complicated calculation. The other reduction is related to salaries. If there's a reduction in salaries during this 8-week period, that there would also be a reduction in the loan payment that the government's going to make on your behalf. So I've got somebody here that's asked a few questions. I think it's my dear friend Whitney. Whitney's question is bonus included in gross payroll? And the answer is yes. All wages, including bonuses and commissions, are going to be included in payroll. The thing to be careful with is that you're only going to include in payroll up to an annualized amount of $100,000 for any one employee. So what you want to be careful with is, let's say you have weekly payroll, and if you take $100,000 divided by 52 weeks, that would be $1,923 per pay period, would equal $100,000 annualized. So if you pay an employee in a bonus and the amount of their total pay with the bonus exceeds that $1,923 per week, then that part that's over that would not be considered an allowable expense. So understanding that is your kind of first planning opportunity, that if you have that situation, you may consider spreading out those payments over the full 8 weeks or over all your payroll periods, so that you can get the maximum amount of those bonuses included in allowable wages. Whitney's second question, how are utilities defined? They define covered utilities as services that were started before February 15th, 2020, and they include the distribution of gas, electricity, transportation, telephone, and other items. If somebody can tell me what transportation cost would be under utilities, I would appreciate that. The best we can come up with is, because I don't think there would be any service that you'd have in place before February 15th. But we have seen in Q&As related to allowable interest expenses that they said business automobiles, as long as they were acquired and had a loan prior to February 15th, interest on automobile loans would be included. And in that answer, they also said the gas on the business automobile would consider a utility expense. So that's kind of a side answer that we got via a different question. But I think as it relates to utilities, I think the big takeaway for the construction industry is, if you have business automobiles, beyond your gas, electric, telephone, cell phones, expenses that you have, but you also may be able to include gas and diesel that you're purchasing during this 8 weeks for your business automobiles. All right, now that Whitney sent the first question, now we got other questions. Somebody here wants to confirm that the $100,000 cap is just salary, then you add health plan. Great question. There was a lot of confusion about that big definition of payroll cost included health insurance and retirement plans. And at the beginning, everybody was applying that $100,000 per year per person cap at the total of the payroll cost. They did confirm afterwards that they meant, for that $100,000 per person, only the amount that was wages. It was meant to apply that cap to. So if you had somebody making $100,000, to illustrate that, the amount they would count against it would be the $100,000 plus the amount for their employer health insurance and the employer retirement contributions. Mobile phones and utilities, third question we got. Yes, we believe that would be included, as long as that service with Verizon or Sprint or whoever your carrier is was in place prior to February 15th, 2020. So I don't think you can go out today and buy new cell phones and new services to cover all your people and it be covered. But I believe if it was in place prior to February 15th, then I do believe that it would be covered. All right, are there any other questions on the expenses that anybody has a question about? Now would be a great time to cover them. We certainly can cover them throughout, but are there any other expenses that anybody has a question about?
So
Go ahead. I think Dane Feldman, I think you're the guy typing here. You can turn off your mic while you type. That would be helpful. A couple other questions that we're getting here pretty quick. The $100,000 is capped on a week-by-week basis. You can't take the 8 weeks in average. That is correct. These calculations need to be done on a per pay period for these during these 8 weeks. Another dear friend there, Elio, asked me about what about new hires? Certainly new hires, if you have new hires, they be included in the calculation for covered expenses. Another question, leased equipment. Is leased equipment to be covered? In their definition of rent, they also included not only the rent of real estate, but also a personal property. So I think those leases that are true operating leases would be covered under the covered rent provision. I think if they're capital leases, which means they're more financing in general, then I think only the portion of the lease payment that is really for interest would qualify. And once again, those things need to have been in place prior to February 15th to cover. What about mileage we pay for gas for employee cars? That's a great question. If that is a policy that you've had and it was in place prior to February 15th, I think based upon the guidance we have today, I don't think we have anything that says that that would be excluded. I think the thing that everybody would like definitive answers on many of these items, and I think we just have to understand there aren't definitive answers. And also they provided in the Q&A, they've said you can rely on the guidance that's available at the time of your application. And if further guidance is given that's contrary to what you relied upon, that the borrower can continue to rely on the guidance that was provided. So as that relates to the forgiveness provision, I think while we're still expect further guidance and your application for forgiveness, you won't be able to turn in until after the 8 weeks, clearly. As long as there's not guidance to the contrary on those items, I think we can document good, reasonable reasons on why we believe things like rent for parking lots should be included. That was one of the other questions we had, was on paid parking rent. So we do believe rent for buildings, but also any other rent that you're paying would qualify. All right, another question. Trying to limit overtime for highly paid hourly staff, especially on prevailing wage jobs, is something we should be mandating to project managers for the next 8 weeks. If you're concerned that your individuals would go over the $100,000 because of that, that may be something that you would consider doing. But what I think we'll demonstrate by the time we get through the end of this presentation is that really the answers to those questions can't be made until you've done a complete 8-week projection of all expenses, and you've done all the calculations for these reduction calculations. I think once you do all that, then you can see what's the impact of having people that are working overtime or working extra hours. But I can tell you there are a couple scenarios where I can see where it would be beneficial to the companies if they didn't have people working overtime and had more people working during the 8 weeks. If the money was in your bank on Friday, but you were not notified until Monday, does the clock start on Friday or Monday? I'm going to say the money was available to you on Friday. It was in your bank. Unfortunately, your clock started on Friday. I think that's pretty clear. Do we know what the interest rate will be for the amount of the loan that is not forgiven? The interest rate on the entire loan is 1%. We do know that. That part is clear. And from the day you get the money, it is accruing interest. The only way that the interest accrual is going to be part of the forgiveness amount, or you're not going to pay it, is if 100% of your loan has been forgiven. We do believe that the amount of your loan that is forgiven, you're also going to pay the principal and the interest on that loan. But we do know it is 1%. All right. The other calculation we need to be worried about, we talked about the headcount one and then also the salary reduction calculation. Those are the two areas where even whatever you spend, they're not going to forgive 100% of those expenses if you don't meet 100% of these calculations. And it's going to be a pro rata reduction. So it can be pretty significant. So let's get into those. All right, let's talk about the headcount reductions. The headcount reduction is going to be based upon your full-time equivalents during this 8-week period of time compared to one of two periods. You get to choose these two periods. The first being what we're calling the 2019 base period, which is February 15th, 2019 through June 30, 2019, or the 2020 base period, which is from January 1, 2020 through February 29th, 2020. So these calculations, let's talk about them a little bit. So the things to know about these calculations are you have to calculate full-time equivalents. So how do you do that? They didn't give any guidance in the law on how to calculate a full-time equivalent. Probably everybody on this call, if asked, what's a full-time person, you'd say somebody that worked 40 hours a week. And that certainly could be as good a definition as any. We think more likely than not, when guidance is released, they will say to rely on the calculation or definition of a full-time equivalent that was used in the Affordable Care Act. And that definition was any individual who worked more than 30 hours a week or more, was considered a full-time equivalent. So if you worked 50 hours or 60 hours, you counted the same in this calculation as someone who worked 30 hours. You counted as one full-time equivalent. And in the CARES Act, or Affordable Care Act, they also said for everyone who's not a full-time equivalent. So essentially, anybody that's working less than 30 hours, then you total up all of those individuals' hours for a full month and divide by 120 to determine how many full-time equivalents your non-full-time workforce make up. There's a planning opportunity there, in that if you look at the definition for full-time equivalent at 30 hours a week, and there being 4.3 weeks in a month, then that equates to 130 hours. So you can actually reach one full-time equivalent quicker because you're dividing all your what we would call part-time people by 120 instead of 130. So if you have somebody that's working or if you have two people that are working 20 hours a week, or let's say 15 hours a week each, that would be 30 hours. You would take their total hours and divide by 120, and they would be more than, it would be like 1.4 full-time equivalents. So something to think about. Certainly you have to be consistent in the method that you use. But we're having all of our clients today, or before they get the money even, go and let's do these calculations. You're going to have to do them for the reduction calculation, or for the forgiveness calculation when you turn it into your bank. So you're going to have to do them. So we're not asking you to do any work extra. We're having to do work twice. But let's go ahead and do that work now, because we see this to be a significant planning opportunity. And you need to know, are you at risk for this reduction calculation to decrease your forgiveness, to decrease the amount of loan payment that the government would make on your loan. And just as a reminder, the total that you spend is the kind of your starting point. It's not the total of the loan. And then these reduction calculations come into play. For example, let's say that during the covered period, you've got 9 full-time equivalents, and during the 2019 base period, the calculation said you had 12, and then the 2020 base period, it said you had 10. You would use 10, obviously being the lower number, so then it would be 9 over 10, or 90%. So then of your total expenses that you covered expenses that you had paid during your 8 weeks, then only 90% of that would be forgiven via the government making a payment on your behalf. Or inversely, it would reduce your forgiveness by 10%. So you can understand the issue that you would have if that were to come into play. New question we got: do interns/co-op count as full-time equivalent if they work over 30 hours? We believe the answer to that is yes. We think it's just based upon your employees and how many hours they work when applying this. So we think you just need to take your total workforce, and in these calculations, we're instructed to calculate a monthly average. And when they say in the calculation of that monthly average, we want you to do the calculations per pay period. So if you have weekly pay period, you need to do that calculation of full-time equivalents every single week during these 3 periods that we're talking about. And then come up with an average for each month that falls within these periods, and then average those monthly averages in these calculations. Okay, I get this question a lot. This is a great question. The application just asks for number of employees, not full-time equivalent. On your application, actually what they were asking for was number of jobs. That number that you put on the application had nothing to do with these reduction calculations. The purpose for that particular number, the number of jobs, was seeing if you were eligible for the loan. Certainly the biggest criteria that we talked about was the 500 employees. And so that was the purpose for that. But we got that question a lot. People thought, oh, well, geez, if I write this number, if I put down this number, I got to get this number exactly right, because that's the number they're going to hold me to for maintaining headcount. That was not the purpose of that number at all. Other question, what if you included part-time employees in that number? You were supposed to include part-time employees in that number. And being eligible for the loan and the requirements that most organizations needed to have fewer than 500 employees, that was all employees. That was not full-time equivalents. So it was, if you had 50 people and they were all part-time and they equated to 20 full-time equivalents on the application, you were supposed to write 50. Then everyone's wanting to know, like I mentioned, will they hold you to that number? They will not. That was not the intent of that number on the application. You're going to have to do these calculations. So this forgiveness provision is what is the authority related to that amount that the government will pay on your loan. And nowhere in here does it talk about jobs or talk about the number you used on your application. Another question, if you pay an employee but they're not actually working because spouse is high risk, does that count as a full-time equivalent? That's a great question. I think if you're paying the employees and you're paying them and they were full-time prior to that, then you're just providing sick pay or family leave pay benefits to them. And if you're paying them at the same rate, then the assumption is you're replacing all of their pay via all their hours. So I would say that you would actually use it. All right, I got somebody saying, no, it actually says number of employees. On the application, it says number of employees. In the forgiveness calculations in 1106, it's specifically word for word, it's saying full-time equivalents. So it's not, that part's not true. So another question, so it's not the true weekly average during a base period, but instead is the average of the monthly averages during the base period. Yes. So you have to calculate, in calculation of the monthly averages for full-time equivalents, for that purpose, they specifically say the way we want you to calculate that is we want you to calculate your full-time equivalents per pay period. So yes, that's what we're saying. Next question, if somebody's paid monthly, do you need to start paying them weekly? I do not believe so, that you need to pay somebody weekly. I think you should continue to pay them with the same frequency that you have been doing payroll, and we'll work with, once we get better guidance on how they want us to divide up that pay period that's paid during the 8 weeks at the beginning, that was for a previous period, and that then the one that was paid after the 8 weeks at the end of the period. I think the intent certainly is 8 weeks worth of wages, and likely we're going to prorate both of those. I think likely once the application for forgiveness is submitted, but I think for planning purposes today, I think you can just simply use the pay periods that fall within the 8 weeks. Back to more questions about the expenses. For renter, you're going to have to multiply times 12 divided by 52 times 8. I think you should. I think it's got to be rent paid, so you got to have rent that you actually paid. But I think you may have to also, if the 8 weeks are not going to line up perfectly with 2 months, they're going to straddle a couple months. So you probably need to make sure you've paid 2 months rent. And then the amount that you would include probably needs to be turn it into a weekly amount. All right. Moving along here. Salary reductions. There are 2 areas in 1106 that are extremely poorly written. The rehire provision is the worst written provision. This is the second worst poorly written provision. The salary reduction calculation says that you take the total salary or wages paid during the covered period, meaning the 8 weeks, and you compare it to the amount that was paid to the employee for the full quarter prior to the covered period. And if there has been a reduction in more than 25%, then the amount of the reduction that's more than 25% reduces your forgiveness. You just can't apply that provision by taking a literal meaning of it. The covered period being 8 weeks, a full quarter is 13 weeks. So if you paid somebody the exact same amount, $1,000 a week, for 8 weeks, $8,000 compared to $1,000 a week during a full quarter, 13 weeks, $13,000, you've got a $5,000 reduction, which is more than 25%. closer to 35%. So we think you can't interpret a literal reading of the law for that provision. We think what they meant is if you paid somebody $10 an hour during this 8-week period, but during the previous quarter you paid them $20 an hour, that would have been a 50% reduction in their pay rate. And so therefore the amount that was more than 25% should go into reducing the amount of the forgiveness, the amount that the government's going to make as a loan payment on your loan. That would theoretically make sense. Having it be total wages doesn't make any sense. Having it be for all employees doesn't make any sense, because we've already taken care of the headcount issue related to the FTE calculation that we've done. So you wouldn't think that there would be a penalty that would impact you twice. So I think we're going to have to rely on getting definitely more guidance on how this calculation is to be applied. What we can do is they have said we won't include any employee in this salary reduction provision who for any one pay period in 2019 made more than $100,000 on an annualized basis. All right, so let's kind of break that down, what that means. So using the example that I gave before of $100,000 divided by 52 weeks is $1,923 per pay period if you pay weekly. If you went back and you looked at the employees that you currently anticipate paying during these 8 weeks, and you went back to 19 and said, did any week during 19 they make more on a weekly basis, more than $1,923, then we won't have to worry about them impacting this reduction calculation. I know with working overtime in construction, it's fairly common that you may have many of your workforce during one pay period may be over that amount. So I believe the real planning opportunity today is go through and look at your employee roster that's going to be active during these 8 weeks and just see how many of them you can exclude, meaning you don't have to worry about for salary reduction. Couple questions that I've got. We have prevailing wage jobs and regular pay jobs throughout the normal course of a year. If we do not have a prevailing wage job currently, the salary will naturally be reduced. Is that taken into account? We've got no guidance on that. Just like I mentioned, a literal reading of the law is very troublesome because you're going to be subject to a reduction almost in every case if we just compare total pay 8 weeks compared to total pay for 13 weeks. So there's no guidance that says, if your pay rate is changed because of prevailing wage jobs, that you're going to be exempt from this calculation, whatever it is. So I think that's why we need to be careful with how we spend the money and how we rely on these forgiveness calculations. But once again, I think the bigger planning point is going to be, can we exclude our current workforce from being subject to this reduction calculation because they made in one pay period annualized basis more than $100,000? A good question that we just got that shows how that would impact people is, would a bonus paid in 2019 count as a pay period? Certainly it would. If you paid somebody a bonus and that bonus caused their total pay in that pay period to be more than $100,000 annualized, literal reading of the law says they would be excluded from this calculation. And that's where we're telling our clients, hey, we don't know exactly how this is going to be calculated, but we do know that we get to exclude all of those people. So what can we do today is we can size up what's our exposure in this area by being able to go through and reduce those people that we know are going to be over that. All right. Moving along, we're having to continually keep on top of the guidance as it comes out. From March 27th till today, it's felt like there's been new information every single day. What I'm sharing with you today is what we know as of today. There's new information, and it's not just new interpretations. Sometimes it is new information. The 75% on cost is a good example of that. There was nothing in the CARES Act in 1102 for the loan, nothing in the CARES Act in 1106 related to forgiveness that put in the requirement that 75% had to be spent on payroll. That requirement came about by guidance provided by Treasury Secretary in their pretty funny to think about, but they call it their interim final rule. And they've done it twice now, given 2 interim final rules. But there is some significant pushback in Congress regarding that provision. I've seen letters that several Congress people have written to Treasury Secretary and the administrator of SBA to say, we did not intend to put additional restrictions on use of these funds. So we think you should rethink that as a requirement. So I think it's very likely that there will be potentially additional requirements and or relief from that requirement as we go forward. So being able to stay up to date with the information as it comes out, especially be focused on this forgiveness portion, because you can see it's a huge impact. Some of the additional planning opportunities that we're talking to people about are maximizing your qualified expenditures. Maybe now that you've went through this and you understand those reduction calculations and you think, hey, that's a real risk for our business, that even if we spend the money, that 100% of the loan will not be forgiven because those reduction calculations will apply to our situation. One of the things that you could consider doing is maybe you'll have expenses that are more than the loan. They haven't given guidance on the ordering rules on how you apply these reductions, but it certainly will matter. But to date, the way a literal reading of the law says you take total allowable expenditures less those reduction calculations, and then at the end, the loan forgiveness can't be more than the loan. So that leads us to believe that you could have qualified expenses that exceeded the loan, still have the reduction calculations apply, and the end result still could be 100% of the loan amount. So maybe what you do is you say, what can we do to kind of drive up those expenses? We talked about bonuses and spreading bonuses or commissions over several pay periods to try to maximize the amount that is allowable. We think that's a key area that people can do. Certainly the utilities, we've talked about distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet. It's a pretty broad definition for utilities. And we also mentioned gas for business vehicles. And then we just mentioned about the starting point for those calculations. They haven't provided guidance on, hey, you have to do these in this particular order. So we believe that you can start with allowable expenses, do the FTE reduction, do the salary reduction, and then check to see if the net amount is more than the loan, then 100% of the loan would be forgiven. Some of the other planning opportunities, if you're finding that the reduction in headcount could apply to you, we think you would consider, if you've got people that are working overtime, certainly, but even people that are working 40 hours a week, maybe you get your headcount up by limiting their hours, but bringing more people back, just so you can get that FTE count to be more favorable for your situation. Once again, to know whether you should do that or not, you kind of need to go through all of these calculations. You need to know, hey, do we really need to make a change to be able to hit that maximum amount? So you have to go through essentially all three of those calculations to be able to do that. And then the other area is just with the part-time workers. Just like we illustrated, you can actually get more full-time equivalents per hour if they are part-time people that are working less than 30 hours a week. So maybe if you're really close, you need to move up your average a few decimal points. That may be an area that you can look into and do. Salary reductions, we talked about that as I think those are it's the most difficult calculation to apply today because of how it's written. And we believe that the planning point is twofold. One, try to get as many people excluded from the calculation like we've discussed. But then also, we think the intent was based upon pay rate. So just check to make sure that people's pay rate is not less than 25% of what it once was. Most people have said, hey, you've got to pay them exactly what you paid them before. We don't believe that to be true. We believe they've allowed for there to be, you manage your business and there to be a reduction of up to 25%. But we do want some more guidance on clarity on if it's on total pay or on pay rate. But we think it is logical that they probably meant pay rate. Well, another question we received, we have 2 employees who are out on medical leave that started in 2019 prior to this event. Can they be excluded from the full-time equivalent count because they're not likely to be returning? So if they're out on medical leave, if they're not being paid, then they're not working hours. If you're paying them, then they would be included. When they were hired doesn't matter. It's just who's on the payroll during these 8 weeks. So if you hired them yesterday or you hired them in 2000, that part doesn't matter. It's just who are the people that you have hired now. Some of the other areas, unique areas that I think there's opportunities when we talk about in payroll calls, they include retirement contributions. If you think about retirement contributions, usually those are paid certainly in arrears by sometimes a whole year. Most of those employer contributions, you certainly can pay them with every payroll. Many companies, though, don't pay those until the filing of their tax return, and they can delay them all the way up to the extended due date of their tax return. So in those instances, you're paying those well in arrears. So how does retirement funding work when we're talking about incurred and paid? We think to meet that threshold, it's going to have to be retirement contributions that are paid during the 8 weeks that are related to the 8 weeks worth of payroll. So we think you need to have some planning with your TPA if you're somebody that pays those in arrears to be able to see, hey, how can I make a payment earlier than I usually do and it apply to this 8-week period of time. The other thing, we know we have several construction companies here in town are ESOP owned. For those that are familiar with ESOPs, essentially it's a big retirement plan and the company makes a contribution to the ESOP on behalf of the employees annually. And that amount typically usually gets returned to the company via a loan payment because the company has lent the money to the ESOP to purchase the company. And once again, that is usually done at year end or after year end. We believe you need to work with your TPA related to your ESOP to say, hey, we want to make a payment during the year, during these 8 weeks, so that it'll qualify for this. Your TPA can work with you to calculate what that amount would be. The other thing is many companies during this epidemic have asked for deferrals of their expenses, whether it be rent, loan payments, etc. Certainly now would be the time not to defer those payments because they're allowable. And so we're saying consider calling either your landlord or calling your bank and saying, hey, I want to be able to make the payments specifically for these 8 weeks. Can I extend my deferment that we've previously agreed to 8 weeks further out? We fully expect that everybody will be fine with helping you do that. But certainly that is a planning opportunity. Are there any other questions or any other comments that people have? We've tried to cover as much as possible related to this forgiveness calculation. We know for most construction companies, you all are busy working. You got people in the field. You have some people that are likely have been laid off or furloughed. But for the most part, the construction industry has been able to continue working. So I'm hopeful that means this will be this P3 program will be especially beneficial to the construction industry. And while I know you're not like many other businesses that have been shuttered during this, I'll just say I think this is still a very important provision. I think construction companies certainly will need this, because the impact of this, unfortunately, while not during this 8 weeks, may be for your company, but it will be felt in the future. This is going to impact all of us, and you have to get assistance when it's available. But you also need to do your planning. So other questions that we've just got: Ohio workers' comp is it based on when actually paid? Does the 2018 refund matter? I don't believe the refund matters in this question. I think it's only when paid. If the refund reduces the amount that you're paying, that would be an issue, which might be the case for some. But I think as long as you're making those payments, that would be good. Looks like I got a few friends on here that says thank you for the information. We've got on here, ACI has done a great job of providing information. Keep looking at that toolbox. They'll keep putting the information out there when it becomes available. Do not hesitate to reach out to me. I know we've got a few clients that are on here, and many of you, the rest of you are not clients. We certainly would like to make you a client, but we're always here to help, and I'll always be responsive. You shoot me a question, I'll get you an answer the best I can. This is, times we've never seen, and we want to make sure that you all are making good decisions. So don't be shy. Don't be a stranger. I'll always help you. Jen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Great information. Thanks again for doing this for us. We really appreciate it. And thanks again to everybody who spent some time with us this morning. I hope you learned a lot. And like Stephen said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to him or to me, and I'll get your questions to him. But I hope to have the recording, and we'll share the slides as well, if that will be helpful to everybody by tomorrow. So if there are no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. I think we're good. All right, everybody have a good day. Thanks, Stephen.
All right. Thank you all.
Bye.